The black tie cost more than my monthly paycheck, but the broken broom was the thing that changed both our lives. I didn't know his name that night. I only knew that whoever owned the silk black tie lying across the polished marble floor probably lived in a world where people never noticed someone like me. My name is Grace Carter, and at 26 years old, I spent my nights cleaning up after people who celebrated fortunes I couldn't even imagine. Midnight had already slipped past when the last limousine disappeared beyond the curved driveway of the Ashford Grand Hotel. Crystal chandeliers still glowed overhead, reflecting off spotless marble floors that looked too perfect for ordinary shoes. The ballroom smelled of expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and the fading sweetness of champagne that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I tightened my blue housekeeping apron and pushed my worn cleaning cart across the silent room, listening to the soft squeak of its wheels echo beneath the towering ceilings. My shift always began after everyone else's evening had become a memory. Rich people left behind empty glasses, wrinkled napkins, forgotten jackets, and conversations that floated away long before I arrived. I was invisible, and most nights, I preferred it that way. Invisible people didn't become stories. They simply cleaned them away. I swept glittering confetti into careful piles while soft piano music continued playing through hidden speakers, almost as if the building refused to admit the party had ended. Every polished table reflected the golden light like still water. Someone had left behind a bouquet of white roses. Another guest had abandoned a designer scarf worth more than the used Honda Civic waiting for me in the employee parking lot. Then I saw it. A perfectly folded black silk tie resting beside one of the ballroom chairs. It looked untouched, as though someone had carefully placed it there instead of forgetting it. I picked it up gently, surprised by how smooth the fabric felt against my fingers. There wasn't a single wrinkle in it. Whoever wore it probably had assistants who worried about wrinkles for a living. I smiled to myself before hanging it neatly over the handle of my cleaning cart. Lost and found would open in the morning. That's when I heard laughter behind me. 3 guests who hadn't quite finished their evening wandered back into the ballroom looking for something they'd misplaced, their polished shoes clicking across the marble. One of them glanced toward me for barely a second before returning to his conversation as though I were another piece of furniture. I had grown used to that look, the one that traveled through you instead of toward you. It didn't sting anymore. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I reached for my old broom, the same broom I'd used almost every night for nearly 2 years. Its wooden handle had been repaired twice with tape, and the bristles leaned slightly to one side after thousands of hours gliding across expensive floors. As I pushed it forward, the handle suddenly cracked with a dry snap that echoed louder than it should have in the empty ballroom. The broom split cleanly in half, the broken wood sliding across the marble before stopping near a pair of polished black dress shoes that had appeared so quietly I hadn't even heard the footsteps. I slowly lifted my eyes from the broken broom to the man standing before me, and before he said a single word, the entire room somehow felt different. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of us moved. The broken handle rested between us like an awkward introduction that neither of us had planned. I expected irritation. I expected the quiet disappointment wealthy guests usually reserved for people wearing housekeeping uniforms. Instead, the man simply looked down at the cracked wood before lifting his eyes to mine. They were a cool gray-blue, calm enough to make the enormous ballroom feel strangely smaller. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that somehow looked untouched after an evening filled with hundreds of guests. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and there was nothing flashy about him except the effortless confidence that surrounded him. It was the kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself. I immediately bent down to collect the broken pieces. "I am so sorry," I said automatically, even though the broom belonged to the hotel and had already survived more repairs than it probably should have. "You do not need to apologize," he answered in a steady voice. "It broke." His words caught me off guard because they sounded simple, almost obvious, yet people rarely separated accidents from blame. Before I could respond, the 3 guests behind him finally noticed what had happened. One of them laughed softly. "Looks like maintenance needs maintenance," he joked, earning a few polite chuckles from the others. I felt my face grow warm, but I kept gathering the splintered wood without looking at them. Embarrassment had become another part of my uniform. The man in front of me did not laugh. He glanced toward the group with an expression so brief I almost missed it. The conversation behind him stopped on its own, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to ripple through the room. None of the men said another word. They simply nodded politely to him before excusing themselves and walking toward the ballroom exit. I watched them disappear, confused by how quickly the mood had changed. Whoever the stranger was, people listened without him asking. He crouched beside me before I could protest and picked up one of the larger pieces of the broom handle. I blinked in surprise. Men wearing watches that probably cost more than my apartment usually did not kneel on marble floors beside janitors. "Careful," he said quietly as he handed me the wooden piece. "There is a sharp edge." I accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you." For a moment neither of us spoke. Somewhere in the distance an elevator chimed. A vacuum cleaner hummed from another hallway. Outside the towering windows, rain began tapping softly against the glass, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons of gold and white. He noticed the black silk tie hanging over my cleaning cart. "You found that?" he asked. "I did," I replied. "I was going to leave it with lost and found in the morning." He looked at the tie for several seconds before smiling faintly. "You could have thrown it away." I almost laughed. "It belongs to someone. Things deserve the chance to find their way home." His expression changed ever so slightly, not into amusement but into genuine curiosity, as though that answer had surprised him more than anything else that evening. "Not everyone believes that," he said. I shrugged. "Maybe not. I still do." He studied me with the same quiet attention that made me strangely aware of every sound around us. There was no judgment in his eyes, only questions he had not asked. Then voices echoed from the hotel entrance. Several men in dark suits walked briskly into the ballroom, immediately scanning the room until they spotted him. The moment they did, their posture straightened. One of them approached carefully and spoke in a respectful tone. "Mr. Blackwood, everyone is waiting for you." Only then did I finally learn the name of the stranger standing beside my broken broom, and judging by the way every person in the room seemed to pause when he turned toward them, Adrian Blackwood was not just another guest. The men who had entered did not raise their voices or rush toward Adrian Blackwood. They simply waited, hands folded in front of them, their patience somehow carrying more authority than impatience ever could. Adrian looked at me one last time before carefully taking the black silk tie from the handle of my cleaning cart. "Thank you for keeping it safe," he said. "It was the right thing to do," I answered. He gave a small nod, slipped the tie over his shoulder, and walked away without another word. His polished shoes echoed across the marble floor while the men followed half a step behind him. Nobody told them where to stand. They simply seemed to know. I watched until the ballroom doors closed behind them. Only then did the room feel ordinary again. The silence settled back into familiar sounds. Air conditioning hummed above me. Somewhere down the hallway someone laughed. My manager, Linda, appeared moments later carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. "Grace," she called, her voice carrying the sharp edge that usually meant another unexpected assignment. "The East Ballroom needs to be ready before 7 tomorrow morning. We have another charity breakfast." I lifted the broken broom with an apologetic smile. "I will need a replacement first." She glanced at the cracked handle and sighed. "I have been asking maintenance for 3 weeks. Apparently new flower arrangements matter more than housekeeping equipment." That answer did not surprise me. Beautiful things always seem to receive attention before useful ones. Linda disappeared into the storage room and returned carrying another broom that looked older than the first. The handle had scratches from years of use, and the bristles spread unevenly across the floor. "It is the last one," she said. "Make it work." I smiled anyway. I always do. Nearly an hour passed before the ballroom finally looked untouched again. Every chair stood perfectly aligned. Every table reflected the chandeliers above like mirrors. If someone walked inside now, they would never guess hundreds of people had celebrated there only hours earlier. I emptied my dustpan into a trash bag and pushed my cart toward the service elevator. As the elevator doors opened, 2 hotel employees stepped inside whispering excitedly. They lowered their voices when they noticed me, but not before I caught a familiar name. Blackwood, one of them murmured. He bought another company last month. The other shook his head. People say he owns buildings all over Manhattan. They noticed me listening and immediately changed the subject to weekend schedules. I stared at the glowing elevator numbers without saying anything. The man who had helped me pick up a broken broom apparently belonged to a world far larger than I had imagined. Outside, the rain had become steady by the time my shift ended. Water shimmered beneath the yellow parking lot lights as I unlocked my aging Honda Civic. The driver's door complained with its usual creak before I climbed inside. My hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment before I started the engine. Exhaustion settled over me like a heavy blanket, but my thoughts kept returning to Adrian's expression when I told him that lost things deserved the chance to find their way home. Nobody had ever looked at me quite like that before, as though an ordinary sentence deserved careful consideration. I drove through quiet Manhattan streets where expensive towers disappeared into low clouds, wondering why a man surrounded by power had spent several minutes talking to someone whose name he had never asked. Across town, in an office overlooking the sleeping city, Adrian loosened the silk tie he had reclaimed, but instead of placing it on the polished desk in front of him, he found himself thinking about the young housekeeper who had worried more about returning a stranger's belongings than replacing the broom she depended on every night, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he asked his assistant a question that surprised even himself. Who is Grace Carter? The next morning I woke after barely 5 hours of sleep, yet Adrian Blackwood's question lingered in my mind even though I had never heard it. My tiny apartment overlooked a narrow street where delivery trucks rattled past before sunrise and the neighborhood bakery filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. My life was wonderfully ordinary. I watered the small fern sitting on my kitchen windowsill, packed a peanut butter sandwich for lunch, and drove through slow Manhattan traffic back toward the Ashford Grand Hotel. By 8 o'clock the Grand Ballroom looked completely different from the night before. Round tables were covered with crisp white linens, sunlight streamed through towering windows, and volunteers arranged centerpieces for the morning charity breakfast. It amazed me how quickly a room could erase every trace of the people who had occupied it only hours earlier. I grabbed the old replacement broom from the storage closet and began sweeping beneath the tables before guests arrived. Linda hurried across the ballroom carrying her clipboard with unusual urgency. Grace, the executive office called, she said. Someone wants to see you. I stopped sweeping. Me? She nodded with a puzzled expression. Apparently so. I followed her through quiet service hallways until we reached the administrative offices overlooking the hotel lobby. The receptionist smiled politely and gestured toward an open conference room. Inside sat a man wearing a navy suit with silver-framed glasses. He stood the moment I entered. Miss Carter? He asked. Yes. He extended his hand. My name is Daniel Brooks. I work for Mr. Adrian Blackwood. My heart skipped for reasons I could not explain. Daniel placed a long white box on the conference table and gently slid it toward me. Mr. Blackwood asked me to deliver this personally. I looked at the box but did not touch it. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. He opened the lid. Inside rested a brand new professional cleaning broom crafted from polished maple with thick premium bristles that looked durable enough to last for years. Beside it lay a handwritten card. I recognized the same steady handwriting that had signed the ballroom guest book the night before. The note simply read, "Tools matter because people matter. Thank you for your honesty. Adrian Blackwood." I stared at the words for several seconds before slowly closing the lid. Please thank Mr. Blackwood for his kindness, I said softly, but I cannot accept this. Daniel blinked in genuine surprise. May I ask why? I folded my hands together to keep them from fidgeting. Because if my employer cannot replace broken equipment, that is a problem the employer should solve. If I accept gifts from hotel guests, even generous ones, people will assume my work can be bought. I would rather earn respect than receive favors. Daniel remained silent, studying me with the same curious expression Adrian had worn the night before. You understand this is only a broom? He asked carefully. I smiled. No. It is much more than a broom. That is exactly why I cannot take it. Daniel nodded slowly before closing the box again. I will deliver your answer exactly as you said it. After he left, Linda hurried into the room with wide eyes. Grace, do you realize who that was? I laughed nervously. Not really. She shook her head in disbelief. Neither do I, but everyone else certainly seems to. Less than 30 minutes later, Daniel stepped into Adrian Blackwood's office, placed the unopened white box on the polished desk, and repeated every single word Grace Carter had spoken without changing even one, and for the first time in years, Adrian found himself smiling not because someone had agreed with him, but because someone had quietly refused him. I expected that strange encounter to disappear into memory like every other unusual moment that passed through the hotel, but the days that followed proved otherwise. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody announced a grand surprise. Life simply continued, and somehow that made every small change impossible to ignore. The breakfast guests came and went in expensive suits and elegant dresses, leaving behind coffee cups, folded programs, and conversations about investments that floated across the ballroom like background music. I swept beneath empty tables while sunlight drifted across the polished marble in slow golden rectangles. Every hour looked almost identical to the one before it, yet I caught myself glancing toward the entrance more often than I cared to admit. I told myself I was only watching for new guests. I knew I was lying. 3 days passed before I saw Adrian Blackwood again. He entered the hotel through the main lobby just before noon, accompanied by several executives instead of the men in dark suits I had seen before. Their conversation remained quiet, but everyone around them seemed to instinctively step aside. Bellhops greeted him by name. Managers straightened their jackets. Even guests who had probably never met him lowered their voices as he walked past. I continued polishing a brass railing near the grand staircase, pretending not to notice. It was easier that way. As the group approached, one of the executives accidentally dropped a leather portfolio onto the marble floor. Paper slid across the lobby in every direction. Without thinking, I set my cleaning cloth aside and helped gather the scattered documents before passing them back with both hands. Thank you, the executive said with visible relief. Adrian accepted the portfolio from him before turning toward me. Miss Carter. I looked up, surprised that he remembered my name. Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood. A faint smile appeared on his face. Daniel delivered my gift. I nodded. He did. And you refused it. I did. The executives exchanged curious glances but wisely remained silent. Adrian looked toward the old broom resting against my cleaning cart. The worn handle had already collected another strip of gray tape where a small crack had started forming near the middle. Your replacement has not improved much, he observed. I glanced at it and smiled. It still works. Barely. Sometimes barely is enough until someone decides to fix the real problem. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. The noise of the busy lobby faded into the distance. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the portfolio before asking, "Do you always answer questions that honestly?" I laughed softly. Only when someone asks them sincerely. Something thoughtful crossed his expression. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. I folded my cleaning cloth before answering. That sounds lonely. His eyes remained on mine a second longer than expected. It was the first time I had seen surprise break through his calm composure. One of the executives quietly cleared his throat, reminding everyone that meetings still existed and schedules continued moving forward. Adrian gave a small nod. Enjoy the rest of your day, Miss Carter. You as well, Mr. Blackwood. They continued across the lobby, disappearing into a private elevator reserved for executives. I returned to polishing the brass railing, wondering why my heart felt strangely lighter after such an ordinary conversation. Upstairs, inside the elevator lined with polished walnut panels, none of the executives spoke until the doors closed. Finally, an older man adjusted his tie and asked carefully, "Sir, may I ask a question?" Adrian nodded once. "You have negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without hesitation, yet a hotel housekeeper seems to be the only person willing to disagree with you. Why?" Adrian looked at his reflection in the polished elevator door before answering with quiet certainty. "Because she is the first person I have met in a very long time who values her dignity more than my approval." The following Monday began like every other workday, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the hotel lobby and polished marble reflecting the early morning sunlight. I tied my hair into a simple ponytail, clipped on my employee badge, and wheeled my cleaning cart toward the executive conference floor. The Ashford Grand was hosting a regional business summit, which meant hundreds of guests would pass through before noon. Busy days usually made the hours disappear, and I welcomed that. The less time I had to think, the easier life became. Linda handed me a schedule before disappearing to solve another emergency. "Conference room 4 first," she called over her shoulder. "The speakers will arrive in 45 minutes. I nodded and pushed open the double doors. The room was enormous, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Sunlight spilled across the long walnut table while rows of leather chairs waited in perfect silence. I began wiping fingerprints from the glass walls, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of ordinary work. 20 minutes later, voices echoed from the hallway. The conference organizers arrived earlier than expected, followed by several guests wearing tailored suits and polished shoes. I immediately stepped aside to give them room. Most people walked past without noticing me. One man did not. He paused just inside the doorway, studying me with an expression that felt more curious than friendly. He appeared to be in his late 40s, his silver tie perfectly centered beneath an expensive charcoal jacket. "You work here?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I answered politely. "Housekeeping?" He glanced at my name badge before smiling in a way that never reached his eyes. "Grace Carter." I nodded once. "That is right." He continued watching me for another moment before one of the event coordinators interrupted to guide everyone toward the conference table. I thought nothing more of it. Guests asked strange questions every day. By lunchtime I had already forgotten his face. Across the city, however, someone else had not. Inside Adrian Blackwood's office, Daniel placed a folder onto the polished desk. "There is something you should know," he said carefully. Adrian looked up from the documents he had been reviewing. "Go on." "Victor Lang attended this morning's business summit at the Ashford Grand." Adrian's expression remained calm. "He attends dozens of conferences every year." Daniel hesitated before continuing. "Hotel staff reported that he stopped to speak with Miss Carter." The room became noticeably quieter. Adrian closed the folder in front of him without reading another page. "About what?" "Nobody knows." The conversation lasted less than a minute. Adrian leaned back in his chair, looking out at the Manhattan skyline disappearing into soft gray clouds. "Victor rarely speaks to strangers without a reason." Daniel understood exactly what that meant. Victor Lang had built a reputation for collecting information the way other people collected antiques. Conversations that appeared harmless often led to opportunities nobody else recognized until much later. Meanwhile, I spent the afternoon replacing towels, polishing brass fixtures, and helping an elderly guest find the hotel library. My biggest concern was whether my old Honda would survive another week before needing new brakes. I had absolutely no idea that my name had quietly entered conversations taking place in offices I would never see. As evening settled over the city, I finished my shift and stepped outside carrying a paper bag with leftover soup from the employee cafeteria. The cool autumn air smelled of rain again. I smiled to myself, grateful for another ordinary day. I never noticed the black luxury sedan parked across the street. I never noticed the driver glance briefly in my direction before calmly pulling away. And I certainly never imagined that, for the first time in years, two powerful men had independently begun asking the same simple question about the hotel housekeeper named Grace Carter. The rest of the week passed with an uneasy calm that I could not explain. Nothing obvious had changed, yet I kept catching small moments that felt strangely out of place. The elderly doorman who always forgot my name suddenly greeted me every morning with a cheerful smile. The burned-out light above the employee entrance was replaced overnight after remaining broken for nearly 2 months. Even the coffee machine in the housekeeping lounge, which everyone had given up on weeks earlier, somehow worked again. Linda joked that miracles must finally be happening at the Ashford Grand. I laughed with everyone else, but part of me wondered why everything seemed to improve all at once. Friday evening arrived with another charity gala, filling the hotel with elegant dresses, polished shoes, and conversations that sounded more expensive than the jewelry glittering beneath the chandeliers. I stayed in the background, pushing my cleaning cart through quiet service corridors while servers hurried past carrying silver trays. Around 9 o'clock Linda rushed toward me looking flustered. "Grace, could you help in the East Hall for a few minutes?" Someone spilled sparkling water near the entrance. I nodded and grabbed a fresh mop. By the time I reached the hallway, several guests had already gathered near the entrance, carefully stepping around the puddle. I placed a caution sign beside the wet floor and began drying the marble. The work took less than 2 minutes. As I finished, familiar footsteps echoed across the lobby. I looked up just long enough to recognize Adrian Blackwood entering with Daniel beside him. He wore another perfectly tailored tuxedo, but this time his attention shifted toward the caution sign before he noticed me. At that exact moment another guest, distracted by his phone, walked directly toward the freshly cleaned section. "Sir," I called politely, "please watch your step." The man stopped just before reaching the damp marble and looked down with surprise. "Thank you," he said before continuing safely into the ballroom. Adrian slowed his pace. "You noticed before anyone else did," he observed. I shrugged lightly. "That is my job." Before either of us could say more, another voice interrupted from behind. "Mr. Blackwood." Adrian turned. The man from the business summit, Victor Lang, approached with a polished smile that seemed carefully practiced. "It has been too long." The two men shook hands with perfect courtesy, yet something in the air suddenly felt colder. Their conversation remained pleasant, discussing charities, economic forecasts, and upcoming events, but neither smile quite reached their eyes. I quietly returned my mop to the cart, hoping to disappear before anyone noticed me again. "Miss Carter," Victor said unexpectedly. I paused. "Yes, sir?" "We met earlier this week." "Yes, sir." He smiled. "You seem to work very hard." "I try to." Adrian remained silent, simply watching the exchange. Victor glanced briefly toward him before adding, "People with integrity are difficult to find these days." "I think there are more of them than we realize," I answered. "Most are simply too busy doing their jobs to be noticed." For the first time Victor's smile faltered ever so slightly. Adrian, however, looked almost amused. A hotel manager hurried over moments later to escort the distinguished guests toward the ballroom, ending the conversation before it could continue. As I wheeled my cart back toward the service hallway, I did not see Adrian quietly speak to Daniel. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. "Starting tonight," he said, "make certain Miss Carter always gets home safely." Daniel nodded once. He did not ask why, because after watching the brief exchange with Victor Lang, he already understood that what had begun as curiosity had quietly become concern. For the next several evenings I noticed something that refused to make sense. Every time my shift ended, the employee parking lot felt just a little brighter than usual. Burned-out lights that had been ignored for months suddenly worked. The security guard who normally sat inside his booth scrolling through his phone was now walking regular patrols across the lot. Once, I even found someone had cleared away a pile of broken tree branches that had been blocking part of the sidewalk after a recent storm. None of it seemed extraordinary by itself, but together it formed a pattern I could not explain. Management must have received complaints, Linda guessed when I mentioned the changes. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was simply paying more attention than before. Late Tuesday night, I finished cleaning the executive dining room nearly an hour after everyone else had gone home. The hotel had settled into that peaceful silence that only arrived after midnight, when the elevators moved less often and every sound echoed through the marble hallways. I pushed my cart toward the service entrance carrying my lunch container and car keys. Outside, the air felt cool and fresh after an evening shower. My little Honda waited beneath one of the newly repaired lights. As I unlocked the driver's door, I noticed another vehicle parked farther down the row. A black sedan. Its headlights remained off, and the driver stayed inside. I thought nothing of it. Plenty of guests used the employee lot when the valet area became crowded. I started my engine and pulled onto the street. At the first traffic light, I happened to glance into my rearview mirror. The same black sedan turned behind me. I smiled at my own imagination. Manhattan streets were full of cars heading in the same direction. 5 minutes later, I stopped at another red light. The sedan remained several car lengths back. Still nothing unusual. By the time I reached my apartment building, however, the sedan continued straight without slowing, disappearing around the next corner before I had even stepped out of my car. I stood there for a moment watching its taillights fade into the distance. It was probably coincidence. That was the reasonable explanation, and I preferred reasonable explanations. The following afternoon, Daniel entered Adrian Blackwood's office carrying his usual notebook. "She made it home safely again," he reported. Adrian nodded without looking away from the financial reports spread across his desk. "Anything unusual?" Daniel hesitated briefly. "She noticed one of our vehicles." Adrian finally looked up. "Was anyone careless?" "No. She simply pays attention." A faint smile crossed Adrian's face. "I have noticed that." Daniel closed his notebook. "She does not know why the security improvements appeared around the hotel either." Adrian walked toward the windows overlooking the city. "She is not supposed to." Daniel remained silent until Adrian spoke again. "End the vehicle escort tonight." Daniel looked surprised. "Sir?" Adrian folded his hands behind his back. "If she discovers that someone is quietly arranging her routine, she will see it as control instead of kindness. I will not become another person making decisions for her without permission." Daniel gave a respectful nod. "Understood." The next evening everything changed in a way I never expected. As I left work, I immediately noticed the familiar black sedan was gone. The parking lot looked exactly as it always had before, ordinary and unremarkable. Strangely, instead of feeling relieved, I felt an odd sense that something quiet had disappeared without my ever understanding it. Across town, Adrian loosened his tie after another long meeting, but his thoughts kept returning to a woman who would rather struggle honestly than accept comfort she had not earned, and for the first time in years he questioned whether protecting someone from a distance was truly respect, or simply another form of power disguised as generosity. Saturday mornings at the Ashford Grand were usually quieter than weekday conferences, but that weekend the lobby buzzed with families attending a charity fundraiser for children's libraries. Bright balloons replaced towering floral arrangements, and the sound of children laughing echoed beneath the chandeliers. It was my favorite kind of event because people smiled without trying to impress anyone. I spent the morning arranging chairs in the ballroom before helping one of the event volunteers carry boxes of donated books to the registration tables. The cardboard boxes were heavier than they looked, but the volunteer insisted on carrying the largest one herself. Halfway across the lobby the bottom gave way. Dozens of colorful books scattered across the polished marble floor. Parents hurried toward their children. Volunteers froze. Without thinking, I knelt down and began gathering the books before little hands accidentally stepped on them. Within seconds several children joined me, carefully stacking picture books into neat piles. "Thank you," the volunteer said with relief. "I should have used 2 boxes." I smiled. Sometimes things fall apart so people have a reason to help each other. One little boy looked up at me with wide blue eyes. "My teacher says books are treasures." "Your teacher is right," I answered as I handed him a storybook with a smiling bear on the cover. A slow round of applause interrupted the moment. I turned to see Adrian Blackwood standing near the entrance beside the event organizers. He had apparently witnessed everything from the beginning. Instead of approaching immediately, he watched as the children carried the books to the tables with proud little smiles. Only after the last book had been placed safely on the display did he walk over. "Miss Carter," he said warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." He glanced toward the children now laughing around the reading corner. "You solved that situation without giving a single order." I looked at the colorful books lining the tables. People usually know the right thing to do. Sometimes they only need someone willing to begin. Adrian considered my words quietly. Before he could reply, Daniel approached carrying a tablet. He spoke softly enough that only Adrian could hear, but I caught one familiar name before they stepped aside. Victor Lang. Adrian's expression remained calm, yet something thoughtful settled behind his eyes. Daniel finished speaking and waited. Adrian answered with only a slight nod before returning his attention to me. "I apologize," he said. "Business never seems to understand weekends." "Neither does housekeeping," I replied with a small laugh. For the first time I heard Adrian laugh as well. It was quiet and genuine, completely different from the careful composure he usually carried. Nearby, Linda noticed the exchange from behind the front desk and nearly dropped the clipboard she was holding. Several employees exchanged puzzled looks. They had never seen the reserved businessman smile so naturally. After Adrian excused himself, Daniel walked beside him toward a private meeting room. "Victor has requested another meeting," Daniel explained. "He has also asked several questions about hotel staff." Adrian stopped walking. "Specifically?" Daniel glanced down at the notes on his tablet. "Specifically about Grace Carter." Adrian remained silent for several long seconds. The hallway suddenly felt much quieter than before. Finally he spoke in the same calm voice he always used, although Daniel recognized the difference immediately. "Curiosity can be harmless," Adrian said. "Persistence rarely is." Daniel nodded. "Would you like me to look into it?" Adrian looked back toward the ballroom where Grace was now helping a little girl choose her first chapter book, completely unaware that anyone was watching. "No," he answered thoughtfully. "I want to know why a man like Victor Lang has become interested in someone who has never asked anything from the world except the chance to earn an honest living." Monday arrived wrapped in gray clouds and a light autumn drizzle that painted the sidewalks with reflections of yellow taxi lights. I arrived at the Ashford Grand 20 minutes early, carrying my lunch in the same faded canvas bag I had owned since community college. Routine had always been my safest place. Unlock the employee entrance. Clock in. Fill the housekeeping cart. Replace fresh towels. Polish brass railings until they reflected the chandeliers overhead. Ordinary work kept life understandable. Around 10 o'clock Linda hurried across the lobby looking unusually excited. "Grace," she called. "The executive conference room needs fresh coffee service." One of the assistants called in sick. "Can you help for a few minutes?" I nodded without hesitation. It was not technically my department, but everyone helped wherever they were needed. I balanced a silver coffee tray and quietly entered the conference suite. The room overlooked Midtown through enormous windows where rain traced slow paths across the glass. Around the table sat several executives reviewing financial reports. Adrian Blackwood occupied the seat nearest the windows, listening more than speaking. Daniel stood beside him with a notebook in hand. I placed fresh coffee cups beside each guest without interrupting the discussion. Most people barely noticed I was there. As I reached Adrian's place setting, a folder resting near his hand shifted slightly as someone across the table reached for another document. A newspaper clipping slipped onto the polished table before drifting to the floor beside my shoe. I bent to retrieve it automatically. My eyes caught only a single photograph before I handed it back. Adrian Blackwood standing beside city officials at the opening of a children's medical center. Another photograph showed him presenting scholarship certificates to graduating students. There were several more images beneath it, all from community projects and charitable events stretching back years. None resembled the rumors whispered by hotel employees whenever his name appeared in conversation. Adrian accepted the clipping with a quiet thank you. I simply nodded and continued serving coffee. As I reached the door, one executive laughed lightly. People still think you enjoy publicity. Adrian smiled faintly. Publicity disappears. Results remain. The words stayed with me long after I left the room. During my lunch break, curiosity finally won. I searched Adrian Blackwood's name using the old computer in the employee lounge. Hundreds of articles appeared. Business acquisitions. Hospital donations. Educational foundations. Disaster relief funding. Youth mentorship programs. Every source described an influential businessman whose companies employed thousands across the country. I searched again using different words, expecting to find something darker that matched the mysterious reputation surrounding him. Instead, I found very little beyond speculation and gossip. Facts remained surprisingly ordinary. Successful. Private. Disciplined. Generous. I closed the browser more confused than before. That afternoon, Daniel found Adrian standing alone beside the conference room windows after the final meeting had ended. You were right, Daniel said quietly. Adrian looked over. About what? Miss Carter saw the newspaper clipping. Adrian waited. She spent part of her lunch break researching you. Adrian smiled with mild amusement. And? Daniel almost laughed. She searched public records instead of gossip websites. Adrian turned back toward the rain-covered skyline. Of course she did. Daniel folded his notebook. Would you like me to tell you what she found? Adrian shook his head. No. You are not curious? Daniel asked. Adrian answered without hesitation. She deserves the chance to form her own opinion without anyone guiding it. Several floors below, I pushed my housekeeping cart through another quiet hallway, still thinking about the articles I had read. The man everyone treated with such careful respect no longer fit neatly into the simple assumptions I had made that first night beside the broken broom. For the first time since we met, I realized I had been trying to understand Adrian Blackwood without ever asking the one question that mattered most. Not who he was, but what kind of man he chose to become when nobody was watching. By Wednesday evening the rain had finally disappeared, leaving Manhattan wrapped in the crisp air that always arrived before winter. The streets glittered beneath fresh sunlight, and people hurried along the sidewalks carrying warm coffee and folded umbrellas they no longer needed. I should have felt lighter, but an uneasy feeling had settled quietly inside me since reading those articles about Adrian Blackwood. The more I learned, the less he resembled the mysterious figure everyone else described. It would have been easier if he had been exactly what people assumed. Instead, every answer seemed to create another question. My afternoon shift ended earlier than usual because the hotel was preparing for a private corporate event that required outside decorators. Linda thanked everyone for finishing ahead of schedule and wished us a pleasant evening. I collected my lunch container, clocked out, and decided to walk 3 blocks to my favorite neighborhood bookstore before driving home. It was a small independent shop squeezed between an old bakery and a family-owned pharmacy. The owner knew nearly every regular customer by name. Books had always been the one luxury I allowed myself without guilt. As I stepped inside, the familiar smell of paper and fresh coffee greeted me like an old friend. I spent nearly 40 minutes browsing the history shelves before selecting a used novel that cost less than $8. Good choice, the elderly cashier said with a smile while placing it into a paper bag. People who enjoy quiet stories usually enjoy that one. I smiled back. Then I think it will fit nicely on my shelf. Outside, the afternoon sun had already begun sinking behind the buildings. I started walking toward the parking garage where I had left my car. Halfway down the block I heard someone call my name. Miss Carter. I turned to see Victor Lang standing beside a black sedan parked neatly along the curb. His expensive charcoal coat looked perfectly pressed despite the breeze. "Good evening," I said politely. "Good evening," he replied with the same measured smile I remembered from the hotel. What an unexpected coincidence. I glanced toward the bookstore behind me. It certainly is. Victor looked at the paper bag in my hand. Buying books instead of expensive things. Somehow that does not surprise me. I offered a small smile without answering. After a brief silence he asked, "May I offer you a ride? Traffic becomes unpleasant around this hour." "Thank you," I replied, "but my car is parked just ahead." His smile remained unchanged. Very sensible. He reached into his coat pocket and removed an elegant business card. "If you ever consider a different career path, I appreciate honest employees. People with integrity are difficult to replace." I accepted the card out of simple courtesy. "Thank you." Before either of us could continue, another familiar voice interrupted from several yards away. "Miss Carter." I turned again. Adrian Blackwood had just stepped out of a nearby building with Daniel walking beside him. He looked briefly from me to Victor before approaching with calm confidence. "I did not expect to see either of you here," Adrian said. "Neither did I," Victor answered smoothly. The two men exchanged polite greetings that sounded perfectly cordial to anyone passing on the sidewalk, yet the air between them felt strangely still. I slipped Victor's business card into my coat pocket, excused myself with a polite nod, and continued toward the parking garage. Neither man attempted to stop me. As I unlocked my Honda and drove away, I never noticed that both Adrian and Victor remained standing exactly where I had left them, watching the same aging car disappear into evening traffic, each quietly realizing that Grace Carter had unknowingly become the one person neither of them could afford to underestimate. The following afternoon the city seemed unusually quiet, as if Manhattan itself had paused between one season and the next. Golden leaves drifted across the sidewalks outside the Ashford Grand while guests arrived carrying briefcases instead of luggage. I reported for my shift expecting another ordinary day, but Linda met me before I reached the housekeeping office. "Grace," she said with an apologetic smile, "the executive lounge is short-staffed again. Could you cover it for an hour?" I nodded and collected a tray of fresh coffee, bottled water, and neatly folded linen napkins. The executive lounge overlooked the city from the hotel's highest floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the room with soft afternoon light, making the skyline appear almost painted against the pale blue sky. Only a handful of guests occupied the lounge, quietly reading newspapers or answering electronic mail. Near the far window sat Adrian Blackwood alone with an open notebook resting beside a cup of untouched coffee. Daniel was nowhere in sight. I quietly refreshed the beverage station before turning to leave. "Miss Carter." His calm voice stopped me. I turned with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood." He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Would you allow me 1 minute of your time?" I hesitated. Employees were discouraged from sitting with guests, yet the lounge remained almost empty. 1 minute, I answered. I remained standing instead of taking the chair. Adrian seemed to notice but did not comment. Instead, he folded his hands together and spoke with unusual sincerity. "I owe you an apology." That was the last thing I expected to hear. "For what?" I asked. "For trying to help you without asking whether you wanted my help." I understood immediately. The repaired lights. The extra security. The quiet improvements that had appeared around the hotel. He had never admitted it, but he did not need to. "You were trying to be kind," I said gently. He shook his head. "Intentions do not erase consequences. Respect means allowing someone the freedom to choose, even when you believe you know what is best." His words surprised me because they sounded less like an explanation and more like something he had been teaching himself. I smiled softly. Then you already learned the lesson. For the first time since we met, silence felt comfortable instead of uncertain. The city stretched beyond the glass while sunlight reflected across the buildings in warm shades of gold. Adrian looked out toward the skyline before speaking again. People spend most of their lives trying to become powerful. He glanced back at me. You made me wonder whether becoming trustworthy is actually harder. I laughed quietly. Trust cannot be purchased. No, he agreed. It has to be earned. I reached into my coat pocket and removed Victor Lang's business card, placing it carefully on the table between us. I think this belongs in your world more than mine. Adrian looked down at the card but did not touch it. Did he pressure you? No. Did he threaten you? No. I smiled reassuringly. He simply offered me a different job. Adrian slowly picked up the card before slipping it into his notebook. Thank you for telling me. I tilted my head slightly. I almost did not. Why did you? He asked. I thought about the question for several seconds before answering honestly. Because I realized something after reading about you. Adrian waited patiently. People trust your reputation, I said. I decided I would rather trust your character. Before Adrian could respond, Daniel entered the lounge carrying several folders. He stopped briefly after noticing the conversation, then smiled almost imperceptibly. Adrian stood as I prepared to leave. Miss Carter. I looked back. Yes? His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable gratitude in his eyes. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to earn that trust instead of expecting me to deserve it automatically. As I walked toward the elevator, I realized something had quietly changed between us. He had not offered money, protection, or influence. He had offered accountability, and somehow that was worth far more than anything his wealth could have purchased. Several weeks passed before I fully understood that some endings never arrive with applause. They arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary mornings that look exactly like every other day. Autumn had settled comfortably over Manhattan, painting the trees outside the Ashford Grand in shades of amber and crimson. Guests came and went beneath the revolving doors. Suitcases rolled across polished marble. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Life continued with its familiar rhythm, yet something inside me had changed forever. I no longer walked through the hotel believing invisible people stayed invisible forever. One crisp Thursday morning, Linda called the housekeeping team together before the first guests arrived. She held a small envelope with an expression I had never seen before. Corporate approved the maintenance budget, she announced. Every housekeeping cart will be replaced this month, and every employee will receive new equipment. The room filled with surprised smiles. Some of my coworkers applauded. Others simply stared in disbelief. Linda handed me the first replacement. It was a brand new broom with a smooth wooden handle and sturdy bristles that stood perfectly straight. I ran my hand lightly across the polished wood before smiling to myself. Weeks earlier I might have wondered who deserved the credit. Now I realized that the answer no longer mattered. Real kindness did not always ask to be recognized. Later that afternoon I passed through the grand ballroom where another charity event was being prepared. The chandeliers reflected across the marble just as they had on the night everything began. As I paused beside the empty stage, Adrian entered through the opposite doors. There were no executives surrounding him this time. No assistants. No urgent meetings waiting. He simply walked across the quiet ballroom until he stopped a few feet away. His eyes settled briefly on the new broom resting beside my cleaning cart before returning to me. It suits you better, he said with a warm smile. I looked at the polished handle and laughed softly. It feels strange using something that does not wobble. Some things deserve to be replaced, he answered. Not because they are worthless, but because they have already carried enough. I nodded, understanding he was speaking about far more than cleaning equipment. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, filling the ballroom with a quiet golden glow. Neither of us hurried to speak again. The silence between us no longer needed to be filled. Finally, I looked at him and asked the question I should have asked weeks ago. Why did you notice me? Adrian considered the question before answering. Because everyone else looked past you. He smiled gently. You reminded me that character is easiest to recognize in the people the world forgets to watch. I felt my eyes drift toward the endless rows of empty chairs waiting for another celebration to begin. I thought I was just doing my job. You were, he replied. That is exactly why it mattered. Somewhere outside, church bells echoed faintly through the city as another ordinary afternoon unfolded. Guests would arrive. Music would play. Someone would eventually spill another drink across another polished floor. Life would continue exactly as it always had. Yet I knew I would never again measure people by the clothes they wore, the cars they drove, or the titles printed beneath their names. I had met a man whose reputation entered every room before he did, but it was not his influence that earned my respect. It was the moment he chose humility over authority and listening over control. As I picked up the new broom and began preparing the ballroom for another evening, Adrian quietly adjusted his jacket and walked toward the exit without asking me to follow. He did not need to. Trust was never built by leading someone forward. It was built by leaving enough space for them to choose the same direction on their own. And as the afternoon light stretched across the marble floor where a broken broom had once changed two ordinary lives, I finally understood that true strength is never measured by the power to command another person, but by the courage to honor their dignity even when no one else is watching.